I'm Joly,
Picard.
and here's our presentation on this data. So, for a baseline, the ultimate loss ratio overall is 47.4%. So this company is doing incredibly well, probably too good for that matter. So our losses range from anywhere from $3 to $37,000, and our premiums range from 15 cents to 8,700. And in these instances, there are approximately 10 premiums per claim, so our frequency is about 10%. So there are no extremes, there's no exceptionally high values, and just about everything looks good for this company from a top-down view. So now as for growth, this company has been consistently growing over the years in terms of premiums, which is mostly due, as mentioned before, to the increase in premiums themselves. And in general, the losses have also matched, although not as noticeable from the trends. The only zone of concern would possibly be 4, because there is about a 20% decrease in premiums earned, and since they still increased the premium amounts, that means they actually lost more than 20% there. Based on, it would be approximately 25%, they lost about, no, I meant 10%. 10%, not 20. So they lost about 12% of their policies in that one zone. So of zones to worry about, 4 would be probably the most significant one. And then on the loss side of the data, zone 12 has been ran exceptionally high premiums, or exceptionally high losses. So it would be worth checking why that happened. Maybe is it a trend? Is it something that's going to be a consistent thing, or was it just a one-time event? Aside from that, the rest of the data is pretty normal, and there's not too much to worry about. Yes? Oh, you were raising your hand.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. Okay, so for distribution of policy types and locations. So I looked at types of policies by form over the years, and it basically does not change in terms of ratios. So there are approximately 80% that are owners, and then 10% each for condos and tenants. So these values don't change over the years much, and in general, they're very consistent, very reliable. In terms of zones, there's a general trend towards going up that doesn't falter, but certain zones, in particular, you can see the drop in zone 4. That's, that one right there. So this is the final year, but the drop is actually very significant. So you can see how that one's dropping off quite a lot, but the rest of these are doing pretty consistently and just slowly rising over time with a few years of drops, but in general, it just keeps going up. So this is frequency, or claims per policy over the years, because we're assuming each one of these premiums and each one of these, we're assuming one claim, there's only one claim per policy. So we don't actually know for a fact that this is quite correct to call it a frequency, but it would seem likely, but we don't have the actual data to figure that out. So looking at this, you can see how tenants have more frequent claims. So whether this is something that needs to be looked at, or it's just a small increase that's not really relevant. It doesn't look like it needs to be looked at just based on how much they're making, but in future years, if costs got worse, that increased ratio for the tenants could be relevant. Aside from that, there's a few zones, 14 and 17 in particular, that have noticeably higher frequency ratios, so it'd be interesting to see why that happened. Was there a bunch of minor weather events that caused, or moderate weather events that caused small damages over a wide range, but not like, why is that a trend? Why is it staying? Why is it consistently higher? But in general, most of this data is pretty average. There's 1 or 2 areas with slightly lower points and a few other high ones, but mostly it's all pretty much just averages out over the 5-year period.
Okay, so next thing we looked at was were the ultimate loss ratios, and we did that by zone and by form. The one on the left is by year and zone. It stays relatively consistent. As you can see, the bulk of the data, the 50% mark of the data, is going down, and then has a little bit of a jump in the year 2016, but in general is going down. You can notice that there are 2 outliers. I think in year 2013 and 2016, based on my graph, which were present and the loss ratios were extremely low in a certain zone. We'll get to that in a minute. And then we also looked at, like I said before, by form and year. This also reflects the downward trend in ultimate loss ratios over the years. Range relatively consistent, but there is some slight variation.
Yeah, the main reason for the pull down is the owners make up the majority. So even though other things are going up, the owners are just dropping, which is making overall the ratio drop.
Yep. As I mentioned before, on the right is the ultimate loss ratio by zone and year. And as you can see, zone number 10 in the year 2013 only had a loss ratio of like 24-25%, which is pretty darn low, if I do say so myself. And then in the year 2016, there's also one that that was around 29%, which was significant. But notice that the grand majority of ultimate loss ratios under this are under 50%. As a trend, tends seem to have fared slightly worse. The loss ratios tend to be a little higher, and also zones number 13, 14, 17 have some noticeably higher rates. Okay, actually, can you go back for just a second?
Yeah.
Okay, so given this table, I thought it'd be interesting to see if we could, find some type of trend in here. Just based on how it looks, it's kind of a mishmash. It's kind of hard to tell anything from this. So I ran a 2-way ANOVA on it, and the results were kind of disappointing. So using year and zone as the dependent variables and the loss ratios as as the independent, using loss ratios as the dependent, and with an alpha of 0.05, you see the p-values on the bottom right over here were relatively high, especially with an alpha of 0.05. So from this, I concluded that no real conclusion can be drawn from this. It doesn't seem that with respect to both year and zone ultimate loss ratios, there doesn't seem to be much interaction happening there. So then I did the same sort of ANOVA, except this time with year and form. And these results were a little bit more interesting. So between the rows, in this case, that would be, the rows would be form. There didn't seem to be much significant interaction, but between the years, although it didn't hit the our alpha of 0.05, an p-value of 0.133 between the years is actually more in line with what one would expect, especially since there seems to be a trend when it comes to the ultimate loss ratios between the years. And if we had more loss data over multiple years, we might be able to see more of a trend and be able to definitively say there was interaction between the years with respect to ultimate loss ratios. Okay, and on to our conclusions. Our data, which we had towards this, actually, can you go back to the first slide by any chance?
Yes.
As you can see, our premium data and our loss data is almost uniform.
Almost, yeah.
I mean, it has a little bit of a skew towards the end of it, but it's almost completely level.
Yeah, if you actually take if you just take the distributions minimum and maximum and make a uniform distribution, the variance and the mean are only off by about 6% each. So it's very close to just an adjusted uniform distribution at the end of the day.
Okay, so that being the case, although we're not able to really, like I said before, we weren't able to find any real trends in the data, that is actually possibly a good thing, because if we're assuming that, okay, so like if we can assume basically not one loss ratio, but we can assume that all the data is consistent with itself, so it kind of lends itself to, I'm trying to say this. I'll get back to that. The main thing we wanted to cover is that our ultimate loss ratio, overall average of 47%. Like mentioned previously, the industry average is about 60%, so a 47% loss ratio average overall. This company is doing extremely well, probably too well. It's probable that this company is overcharging its customers based on the coverage that it's providing. And if other companies were to enter the market, it likely would not stay competitive. So we recommend reducing reducing our rates, especially if other companies are going to enter the area because they'd be in direct competition with us.
So yeah, in general with this, the data for this company is almost too good to be true. It's just, they're making ridiculous profit margins, no one's leaving them, they're still gaining policies over the years. So if this was a hypothetically real company, if they had lowered their premiums to reasonable values, they could have doubled or tripled their consumer base possibly with the amount of premiums they're gaining. Either that or there's no competition. Because with the rates they're setting, any other company could walk in and just take most of their customers overnight. Because it's not plausible unless there's some very ridiculous expenses in terms of like within all companies for some reason. Maybe I don't know what would cause that. It would have to be some non-existing inflation in the current world that could have caused something like that. But in general, it's just not reasonable that they'd be able to maintain these rates without existing either in a void or just had such a brand name somehow that they basically control everything. But that doesn't exist realistically. So yeah. Questions?